welcome to our next podcast. Today, wanting to reflect on how we respond to feedback. There's a wonderful TED talk by Shelia Heen, which talks about how, as receivers to feedback, we have different reactions to feedback. And one of the really powerful points that she makes in this TED talk is she talks about the story we tell about feedback. And I've been, as a psychologist, working with individuals and teams and leaders across organizations over the last 25 years. And very often, part of the conversation is providing some insight, perhaps giving some feedback. But also I've experienced, not only feedback myself in my own life and in the workplace, in sport, but also giving feedback to others. And I've been reflecting on how is it that we react to feedback and what contributes to how we react and the level of reaction that we have. And I agree with Shelia Heen that there's definitely something about the story that we tell. But I think there's something more than just the story we tell about the feedback. I think there's two other aspects of the story we tell about feedback that I think is really important to consider. The first element is, what's the story we tell about ourselves? And so this is the narrative that we present to our family, to our teammates, to our leader, to the people around us. And particularly it's the people who we hold as important and dear in our lives. And what is the narrative that we share with those people? And if that story that we share with the people around us, the narrative, is then in some way challenged or contradicted by the feedback that then we receive, I believe that this results in a significant emotional response to the feedback. Because this narrative that we tell other people is also the narrative we believe about ourselves. And so, for example, if I think I'm an amazing father and a supportive dad, and whenever I'm with people and friends, I'm telling them about how amazing I am as a dad, and this is how good I am, and I'm amazing support, and so that's the narrative that I'm telling other people. That's what I believe. And then if I get some feedback from my daughter, for example, that actually I'm not being a great dad. Now, not only does that really challenge this narrative that I believe, but it also now I'm thinking I'm going to lose face now because I've given this narrative to all these people in my lives who they also now think I'm a great dad, and now I'm giving some negative feedback that contradicts that. And potentially, if I am to take on this feedback, I have to now also tell a different story. But maybe I'm really attached to the story that I'm telling. And the more attached I am to this narrative, the story that I believe and the story that I've shared with others, then the quicker I'm going to dismiss that feedback that's coming in. The quicker I'm going to have a much more emotional reaction to it, but I'm going to defend against it because that feedback challenges my personal narrative. And so I fundamentally believe that the more the feedback contradicts a personal narrative, the less likely the feedback is going to be taken on board. There's a second narrative, though, that I think is a really another really important piece to consider. And this is much more of perhaps an in-depth, internal narrative. And it's really about, am I okay or am I not okay? So it's linked to self-esteem. It's linked to self-belief. It's about how much do I think I am okay as a person? Do I need constant validation from others to tell me I'm okay, or do I know that I'm okay? And my sense is that for those who have a really strong internal belief that I'm okay. So there's things in their lives that they've achieved and they've done where they have some evidence, some validation for believing that I'm okay. They're much more resilient to negative feedback, because then the feedback can be interpreted in a way where the person believes I'm okay, but I need to look at this feedback as potentially something that I can do to improve and get better. And they're much more likely to take it on board. As soon as someone has, I'm not okay, this internal dialogue, I'm not okay, they have a self-esteem that's more fragile. Perhaps there's some events in their childhood, adolescence, where they haven't been successful, where they have a lowered sense of self. They've been rejected by friends, their close networks. There's maybe they haven't met expectations of their parents, of teachers, of people around them. There's a level of disappointment in not meeting those expectations, and therefore resulting I'm not okay, which is essentially a more fragile sense of self, a more fragile self-esteem. And where someone has a more fragile self-esteem, I'm not okay, that feedback, particularly if it's negative feedback, is two possible reactions. So the one is they take it on board and then they use it to further validate I'm not okay, which is it's an irrational process, that, because that's not the purpose of the feedback, but the interpretation potentially is that. Or the person rejects the feedback outright because they're so defensive. There's a need to protect that self-esteem, and so they present, and this is part of that personal narrative of I'm okay, but they're not okay. And so anything that potentially validates that they're not okay, but potentially means they have to look at themselves a bit more honestly, they're going to defend against that feedback. And so then when you add those together, if you've got an individual who not only has a I'm not okay, a fragile sense of self-esteem, and they also have then a personal narrative that they've created for themselves, that they believe and that they've shared now with the outside world about themselves and who they are and what they're about. And this feedback challenges both that sense of self and that personal narrative. Now we're going to get a really big reaction to that negative feedback. And then the story they tell about the negative feedback is then very much a self-centered perspective of their interpretation of the feedback. And in many cases, they will describe it as an attack, as disrespectful, as something that is unfair. And yeah, possibly, because feedback, we know, can sometimes be actually unfair. Sometimes it can be disrespectful. But possibly with someone who has a narrative of a lower self-esteem, I'm not okay, and a narrative of who they are presented in the world, and this feedback, even though it's done with respect and with good intent, will be experienced as very negative. It'll be defended against, and And they'll have a very negative story to tell about that feedback. And I think what this highlights is that when we receive feedback, I believe it's really important that before we allow ourselves to react, that we need to interrogate a couple things. So who's the feedback coming from? What's the likelihood of that feedback is valid and accurate? What do you think is the intention of that feedback? And generally, most people's intent is good. The way perhaps delivered or executed might not be the most effective, but is the intent good? Yes. And then to think about, okay, what is my personal narrative of myself? What's the narrative I'm telling other people? And how much does this feedback challenge my personal narrative? And then also reflect on, what's my sense of self? What's my level of I'm okay or not okay? And how much do these two stories now impact on how I receive this feedback? And if we can get better at being a bit more honest with ourselves about our own personal narratives, have the courage to face into feedback, and potentially face into the reality I might have to change my personal narrative, because maybe my personal narrative, it's something I've created in my mind, that's what I want to believe, but it's not really based, not fully in reality. And I think for many of us, we have how we'd like to be in the world, the story we'd like to be able to tell others, but then there's the actual story. And that's the purpose of feedback, really, is because if we take on board feedback, then ideally the best place, the best state, and this is when we are in our best selves, is where we have a sense of self. I'm okay. That's a healthy sense of self. I have some evidence, some validity to say I am okay. But I also have a story that I narrate about myself, that I believe, that I share with others, that is an accurate story about who I am and how I present in the world. And the more accurate my narrative is, the more likely that I'm going to take on board feedback and process the feedback. And then the story I tell about the feedback is now going to be a more constructive story. And so even though I might still be upset about the feedback, I might have to process the feedback, I might have to work through the feedback, I'm much more likely to approach the feedback in a constructive way. Anyway, these are my thoughts around that concept that Shelia Heen talks about the story we tell about feedback. And I hope that it's maybe prompted you to, either whether you're a giver or a giver of feedback or a receiver of feedback, perhaps think about, how is it that you're receiving feedback? And what is the story you tell about yourself, that image that you present to the world around you? And how much is your reaction to feedback correlated to your story? And is there a good alignment, or do you find yourself reacting to feedback that you're getting from people around you? And perhaps it's something to do with your own personal narrative, or maybe something to do with your narrative around, am I okay?